Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's lecture for Psychology and Law. This week we will be discussing the issues associated with nonviolent crime and with nonviolent criminal acts. So let's go ahead and begin our discussions of this week. This week we will begin first by discussing the issues associated with substance-related crimes and substance-related criminals. Whenever it is that we think about substance-related abuse, what does that necessarily mean for us? A good definition for substance-related abuse is the excessive use of a substance, especially alcohol or drugs. So whenever it is that we're looking at these particular issues associated with substance abuse, it's always very important for us to understand how it is that a specific drug may potentially lead to an individual potentially committing a crime of some sort. Now again, just because an individual is under the influence of a specific drug, let that be a legal or illegal drug, that does not necessarily mean that the individual will be committing a violent act or even a non-violent act. So here we definitely have to make that distinction. Now, what are some of the possible risk factors that affect the connection between drug use and crime? There are a couple of different factors that are very important and related to this particular issue. We do definitely see the pharmacological effects associated with drugs, meaning that some particular drugs may actually create an individual to become a little bit more violent or more aggressive in some of their specific behaviors. We definitely do also see that drugs, those include again legal or illegal drugs, definitely do have effects on brain functioning and the way that they perceive the world. And we've definitely seen some of these behaviors being displayed in some reports in the media in the last couple of years that have identified that individuals who have been excessively using drugs or extensively using drugs have actually committed criminal acts, or who are under the influence of a specific drug committing criminal acts. Again, let those be violent or even non-violent crimes. We do also see that there are economic effects that may drive an individual to potentially consuming drugs or potentially abusing drugs in the future. So violent and nonviolent crimes committed to even obtain the illegal substances are very important, because sometimes an individual's economic status or their socioeconomic status may potentially be lower, and for them to be able to satisfy that urge or that drug need, they may commit again that violent or even nonviolent crimes. Crimes also committed to maintain the dependence and even avoid withdrawal are sometimes seen by some individuals who are committing the criminal acts. So in other words, we know that the withdrawal symptoms that accompany excessive drug use are very, very difficult for an individual to adapt to and for them to actually go through. So rather, what do? They try to avoid the consequences associated with the withdrawal symptoms and go back onto the dependence associated with the drug, and again go back to committing a violent or even a nonviolent crime to obtain the drugs in those specific instances. And then we also do see that systematic connection that occurs between crimes and drug use, in that one involved in the selling of drugs seeking justice for even unpaid debts. So in other words, that even individuals who are even doing an illegal act such as selling a drug, for them to be able to get paid for their specific services, in this particular case illegal services, they may actually seek their own personal type of justice in terms of seeking payment in those particular instances. Now, we also see that there is a relationship between the explanations of drug crime and also how treatment can be used, which is very, very important for us. Now, there are non-causal explanations associated with this relationship, where essentially we have this explanation where drugs don't necessarily cause crime and crime doesn't necessarily cause drug use, but rather through treatment, that be psychoanalytic or behavioral treatment, an individual is able to be able to understand that relationship and no longer see their drug use as leading them to a life of crime, or even their life of crime leading them to have a drug use in that specific instance. So here we definitely do see that those are effective treatments for an individual. We also do have a unidirectional relationship where crime causes drug use, and drug use actually causes crime in the future as well. And for these types of individuals, we tend to use 12-step programs to break that cycle or break that relationship between those factors. And then we also do have a bidirectional issue, or a bidirectional relationship, where drugs and crime are caused and effect of one another. So in other words, the drugs again cause the crime, and the crime causes the drugs in this particular case. And these are also, we do have treatments associated with this by establishing therapeutic communities or support groups for individuals in the future. Now, there are a couple of different models that look at this relationship again between drugs and crime. Walter's integrated model is probably one of the more fundamental or one of the more important models associated with this relationship, where essentially people consume drugs and commit crimes because of incentives and opportunities that are presented to them. So, in other words, these are established through fear, and the fear of rejection by a drug using peer group ultimately influences the person to commit the crime and also to continue to use the drug in the future. And the fear manifests itself when the exposure to drug culture is great. So, in other words, where drug culture is generally accepted by the larger community or by the larger peer group, and ultimately that creates a fear for the individual that if they do not consume the drugs or engage in the behavior that they are engaging in, they may be an out-group member. So definitely this is very important for association with other individuals. So generally these individuals are going to be drawn to a life of crime or life of drug use through these dispositional and even situational factors. And when we talk about dispositional factors, we definitely are talking about more of personality factors or factors that are already innate and built into the person versus situational factors that are things that are driven by the community, driven by the culture, driven by society or the situation that they're actually in. So again, those personality characteristics definitely may be associated with this aspect of why it is that individuals consume drugs and also engage in criminal behaviors, and then also the individual expectations that come from the society or from their group or the culture in that particular instance. Now, we also do see that there is this aspect of initiation and maintenance of criminal lifestyle for some individuals with this, again, relationship between drugs and crime. Looking at the predisposing variables or predispositional variables, meaning that an individual may already come at risk for wanting drugs or for their drug involvement. So, in other words, this may come from a family history of drug use and abuse, pre-existing tendency to act impulsively or aggressively, or they may be what we call sensation seekers in psychology, meaning that these are individuals who look for specific sensations that are very risky in their nature, and thus lead them to potentially trying drugs or even attempting to commit criminal acts in the future as well. We also have the precipitating variables, where essentially an individual is introduced to the drug lifestyle by peers or by imitation of other individuals, and in our readings. Associated with Zimbardo's The Lucifer Effect, he makes note of these particular issues as to how individuals can really be influenced by their peer group or just by other individuals within a group, even if they may not necessarily be friends or family members in any way. But yet we definitely do try to imitate other people's behaviors because we see that as being more beneficial to us than the behavior that we're currently experiencing. And also we find that the experiences with economic rewards that come with actually consuming drugs and also with committing criminal acts sometimes are very rewarding to the individual versus not consuming those drugs and the lifestyle of being with other individuals who also consume, especially with the high-end drugs in these particular cases. And then last, we do also see what's called the maintenance variable, where essentially we have encouragement of a sustained involvement. So in other words, the individual now is encouraged not only by other individuals but also by themselves to continue with that involvement in the use of those drugs or even in those criminal acts in those instances. Now, when we look at alcohol and their relationship with crimes and criminals, again, we definitely do see this aspect of the dispositional versus situational factors as being contributors to individuals consuming drugs, in this particular case, alcohol, and also committing the criminal acts. So when we look at personality traits correlated to the criminal behavior while intoxicated, we definitely do see that individuals, again, are sensation seekers or risk takers in those particular cases. We also see that there's a lot of impulsivity associated with these individuals who also may suffer from lower self-esteem and lower self-efficacy, and also may have higher levels of aggression or natural aggression in these particular cases. Now, whenever it is that an individual is intoxicated, we definitely do see some behavioral changes that may exist. And what are some of those behaviors? Again, take note that some individuals are going to react differently to other individuals. So not all individuals will react in the same fashion. But generally what we tend to find is that the individuals who are intoxicated will increase their aggression. Hence why it is that we tend to have bar fights or people picking fights while they're intoxicated. We also see that they tend to take higher risk taking, especially in men. So generally, this is why you see with men that they will try to engage in communicating with other individuals, let those be males or females, or they put themselves at risk, for instance, of being in a fight when they think that they are stronger or better at a fight what they really are if they were in a non-intoxicated fashion in this particular case. And also even going out and wanting to communicate with other individuals, like I was mentioning, also with females, that they may be at more liberty to actually take the risk of going and talking to them. While if they were not intoxicated, they might not be doing that in searching for a partner. Also, the willingness to drive while intoxicated does increase for some individuals. Again, this is a very interesting phenomenon that we find that while individuals consume more and more alcohol, they believe that they are able to drive better and better, when in reality that is definitely not something that individuals are able to do. We know that if individuals consume any type of drug, again, let those be legal, in this particular case, alcohol versus illegal drugs, definitely driving ability is going to be impaired. There is also a higher degree of engagement in property damage, in gambling, and also a higher risk in sexual behaviors. In other words, a higher likelihood of them engaging, men and women engaging in sexual acts with protected and unprotected sex as well, with individuals that they may know or even may not know in those particular cases. Now, we also see that drug dealing is a very important issue related to non-violent crimes. Whenever it is that we look at the aspects of drug dealing, we do definitely see that there are higher arrest rates for drug dealing. There are harsher punishments associated with drug dealing. And what we tend to find associated with where drug dealing actually tends to occur is generally it's in a very central location of a community. It's generally physically deteriorating in its nature, so generally it's a home that's already maybe been abandoned, where some individuals just know where that they can congregate there and solicit drugs in those particular cases. And there's also social disorganization that exists associated with those neighborhoods. So in other words, they're not neighborhoods that are very formal, or they're very what one might consider to be upscale, or even that they may have very structured organizational systems within the community itself. So in other words, think of a gated community where a lot of individuals know what everyone else is doing within the community. Now, those are not always the cases. There are always going to be exceptions to that. Just today, actually, I was speaking with my sister, and my sister was mentioning that her neighbor in her home, in her neighborhood, and she lives in a very nice neighborhood in Louisiana, her neighbor was actually being arrested for drugs in this particular case. But it was actually very interesting to understand where it is that the person's house was, that it's actually in the center part of the actual community itself of their neighborhood. So everybody kind of knew about it, that was one of those homes that they always knew that person was a little bit what you would want to call shady in terms of some of the behavior that they were doing, that they knew that they were selling drugs to other individuals, until finally somebody reported them in that particular case. Also, we can definitely see that drug dealing can definitely, it's used to predict drug use. So generally we see that the low-income community residents generally tend to have higher drug use. Low status of residents in terms of their occupation also tend to also be related to drug use. And generally, this deals a lot with the aspects of satisfaction in terms of one's own profession and one's own life, and the aspects of self-esteem and also self-worth that we tend to find related to that. Now, some additional issues associated with drug dealing. What's the profile for an individual who's a drug dealer? Drug dealers take many different forms, but the typical drug profile for a drug dealer is an individual who may have an alternative low-paying job or is unemployed. So in other words, they may drug deal to make ends meet. We tend to see this quite often in minority communities, African American and Hispanic communities, as being drug dealers. Now, again, this is not just the case. We do definitely see drug dealing across all communities and all cultures and all ethnicities and all races, but just what we tend to see. And again, this may be related to the aspect of having higher arrest rates. Generally, those are going to be tend to be found for minority groups that may actually be singled out or discriminated against as being individuals who may potentially be drug dealers in those particular cases, the stereotypical drug dealer, what we actually see in the media, for instance. So what are some drug arrest practices that we actually tend to see? The arrests in socially disorganized area generally tend to be more accessible, just because police or law enforcement can actually go in there at any time. Arrest practices in mid and upper level classes neighborhoods are tend to be more difficult, especially since they're more secluded communities and they're much more well organized. They may be hiding that in comparison to the socially disorganized areas. So they may know what's happening in their communities and they may just be turning a blind eye and not even reporting that in those particular instances. So even police patrols in disorganized neighborhoods are actually much more frequent and intense, again, because they can have potentially more access in those particular situations. Now, what are some treatment opportunities for individuals who may be suffering from substance abuse? Definitely, we do see that some states offer drug treatment programs for addicts, and we actually do see that even in the criminal justice system as a whole, that individuals are able to seek some sort of treatment or help, even if they're already within the criminal justice system. So within prisons or within a jail, they may be able to seek out some type of assistance, but not as formally as if you were going into a rehabilitation program on your own. Now, we definitely do see that a small percentage of drug users actually receive needed treatment and rehabilitation. So we do definitely see that there is a disparity between those two issues, that it is much more needed than what it is that's being offered in these particular instances. Now let's turn our attention here to talking about organized crime and the issues associated with organized crime. The first issue here that we'll talk about is the issue of money laundering, which is one of the more famous issues or one of the more common issues related to organized crime. With money laundering, we actually tend to see this very often in many small businesses. Not saying that all small businesses money launder, but this is generally how organized crime is able to actually do money laundering. Essentially, here we have found that the definition for money laundering itself has actually changed quite drastically. But essentially, a good broad definition for money laundering is essentially where we're concealing the existence of income and then disguising it to making it appear legitimate. So in other words, we're taking money that has been made through illegal manners, let that be through drug trafficking, arms dealing, or even other methods that may be illegal in their nature, and essentially now using them through a legitimate business. So think of it in the following situation. You own a lemonade stand. Okay, so what you have to do is you have to report to the government, I have made so much money within this month or within this quarter or within the year. So what do? You have an individual who is a drug trafficker or an arms dealer. They come in with large amounts of money. They need to launder that money through your legitimate business of a lemonade stand. So what do? You say that people have purchased $2 million worth of lemonade in the month of January, and that's what you report to the government. Even though you pay taxes on it and you have receipts saying that you have sold all this lemonade, because again, you have to make it look legitimate that people have actually been buying the lemonade. You make it look legitimate to the government. The government now says you have been taxed for the $2 million that supposedly you have generated in revenues, and now you've brought that money in a legal fashion, rather than having it stashed away as only cash. And now you can use it to be able to buy other properties or other businesses and continue the laundering money scheme in that specific instance. So here, what are the essential activities to money laundering? It's really made up of three parts. There's placement, layering, and integration. With placement, it's changing the illicitly derived money into a non-illicit form and then placing the money into a legitimate financial system. So like I was mentioning, bringing that money into the lemonade stand, saying that you have generated $2 million of lemonade sales within the month of January, the month of February. That's what you report to the government. They tax that. You're only left with, let's say, $1.5 million after taxation. But now you still have $1.5 million in a legitimate fashion, and now what you're able to do is move those funds to conceal the illicit funds. So in other words, you don't want to keep them in the lemonade stand, you want to be able to move them in other places, and we call that layering. And last, the aspect of integration, where essentially you reintroduce the money into a legitimate financial economy. So in other words, you start now investing it in other issues or related to other businesses that you might want to create in those specific instances. Now, granted, I am not endorsing money laundering in any capacity, and I'm not showing you how to do it. I'm just saying this is how it is that it's done in a theoretical fashion. For white collar crimes, now, whenever it is that we think of white collar crimes, these are generally crimes that are committed by respectable individuals, or that's what it's always been. If you look at the definition that's in our textbook this semester, that's kind of the way that it's described. That generally it was always thought of these were crimes that were committed by these respectable individuals of a high social status. That the high social status being a part of their occupation or part of the wealth that they had kind of come up with in terms of their inheritance. But in reality, that's a very, very general definition associated with white collar crimes. So, rather, other definitions have actually been created associated with white collar crimes, such as a violation of business rules to benefit legitimate enterprises. So, this does not account for fraud and embezzlement, but rather you do other types of crimes that are ultimately benefiting you and the enterprise in those particular cases. And we'll talk about some of those in just a couple of seconds. Clinard and Quincy also use the definition of occupational crime, so it's nonviolent infractions of legal codes within an otherwise legitimate enterprise. And the U.S. Congressional Subcommittee on Crime actually defines it as illegal acts committed by non-physical means and concealment to obtain money and property or personal and business advantages in those particular cases. Now, when we look at the aspects of embezzlement, that even though we do look at some of the definitions, for instance, that Donald and Gibson said, that even though white collar crimes don't account for fraud and embezzlement, we will still definitely talk about it as being a white collar crime in this particular instance. The definition of embezzlement is essentially theft of goods that one has entrusted with by another. And essentially what that means is that an individual has actually provided you with some goods, and now what you've done is you've actually taken those goods for yourself, and you've used them for your own benefit or for your own gain, or even the business's gain in those particular cases. So in other words, people invest money in your company, and you take the money for yourself or for the business and help the business grow, but the person doesn't receive anything back in the future. What are some of the criminal profiles associated with individuals who embezzle? They tend to be highly educated individuals. They're known to the person for whom they are stealing. They tend to be model employees and even manipulative and scheming in terms of the way that they actually their specific manner. So they always tend to manipulate other people, or are always scheming to try to generate more revenue for the business or even for themselves. So these may be individuals who go to the boss and say things to the degree of, I know how it is that we can, charge people more money for this specific product because it's what's, popular right now, even though we're paying less. So they always try to find some scheme to be able to increase sales or increase their own profitability in those specific instances. What triggers these aspects of embezzlement? A couple of different things may, if they're suffering through economic hardship, that might be a particular issue that might create the aspects of embezzlement. If there's a manufactured economic need for a specific product, so like I was mentioning, a lot of people are really wanting to buy the specific product. Now let's go ahead and increase, the price of that specific item, or they are charging people more for what the actual company is charging for that price, and then they keep the difference. They may use it also to compensate for healthcare or treatment needs in some particular instances that they can't afford, so they look for other methods to be able to seek out some funds. Now, we also have what are called SEC violations, which essentially relate to insider trading. If you look at the issues related to Martha Stewart from a couple of years ago, this was essentially what she was found guilty of, and she went to prison for a period of time associated with this aspect. And essentially, the idea of insider trading is that there's a misperception, with insider trading, there is really this aspect associated with individuals making decisions to potentially sell stocks or funds associated with the company before it becomes public knowledge to everybody that they are going through some financial hardships, or they're going through some financial issues, or that there's going to be something in a situational factor that might contribute to the funds actually dropping down, or the stocks dropping down in price. So let's say, for instance, I have stocks within a company, and someone comes and tells me, hey, you know what, we're about to go bankrupt. But right now, our sales are high in terms of our stock. So I'm selling my stocks for $20 a stock. So somebody comes and tells me, hey, you know what, we're going to go bankrupt. So what do? I sell those stocks before anybody else knows that we're actually going to go bankrupt. Everyone buys those stocks at $20 a share from me. I make my money. Now the company goes bankrupt and says that out loud to everybody else. So it goes public and says we're bankrupt. Now those funds that we've just or those stocks that we've just sold off to other people, they're completely worthless, and I go and I run with my money. That's essentially the idea of insider trading. So in other words, we have information that's not made public yet, and we use it for our own personal profit in that particular instance, or even for the business's profit in some particular instances. Now let's move our attention to also talking about fraud. When we talk about fraud, fraud can occur in a couple of different forms. Here, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about internet fraud. We're also going to talk about telemarketing fraud. We're also going to talk about identity theft and identity fraud that are pretty important issues related to the way that we actually deal with fraud in some particular instances. In general, aspects associated with internet fraud are the following. There's the aspects associated with auctions and retail schemes, business opportunity schemes, identity theft and fraud, investment schemes, and also credit card schemes. Now, the legal consequences associated with these issues related to internet fraud are generally imprisonment or even serious fines that may actually be placed upon an individual. Now, generally, what we've tried to see, or what has actually been seen within the internet community as of late, is that these types of frauds have actually increased substantially in recent times. Now, why may that be? That may be a variety of issues. Now, a lot more people are becoming a lot more tech savvy. We are relying a lot more on technology as well. How many of our internet purchases aren't actually purchased online versus actually in person or with cash? So here we're actually promoting this kind of aspect in our own way, because we are, in a sense, really relying on the internet for a lot of our transactions that are monetary in their nature. So here we definitely do have to consider that, and we even see that these types of schemes that are taking place not only online but even in person whenever it is that we're dealing with, for instance, credit card schemes in some of these particular instances. Now, one of I think the more interesting aspects associated with fraud are always the telemarketing schemes. Right now, for instance, there are some telemarketer schemes that when they'll call you, it's a pre-recorded message that asks you specific questions and you have to answer yes or no, but yet you don't know who it is that's calling you. This actually happened to me last night, that it was a pre-recorded message on the phone that essentially said, "Is this George?" And it wanted me to say yes or no. And I kept saying, "Hello, hello," because my wife had just told me not even one day before that she had read an article related to that. And every time I kept saying hello, it would say it again. It would say, "Is this George?" But it was in a very pre-recorded fashion. So it's ultimately one of these ways that potentially telemarketers or even other individuals are committing fraud using telephone services to be able to get your approval or get your consent to be able to make purchases. So whenever it is that, for instance, you pay a certain credit card or you pay a bill online or through the phone, many instances it asks you to say yes or say your name, so that way you can agree to making the payment, and that's their official record of you actually having given your consent. So that may be a way that they're actually doing it. With telemarketers, generally the major issue that we see here is that there's a false promise made on offering goods or services, requesting investments, or even asking for charitable donations in some particular instances. I think, and I'm not saying that any of these are actually telemarketing frauds, but it always makes you question the validity associated with certain products whenever it is that you see infomercials late at night, or you see them selling coins on television, or some of the other aspects that related to some of the goods that are trying to be sold to an individual, and then you think to yourself, well, how is it that I'm going to be making a profit off of this, or how is it that I'm going to be using this this good in an effective fashion if they know, or I know, that it's not really a good service, or a good product that they're actually selling in this particular instances. So now there is definitely an issue that we have to address here, that we have to differentiate between fraud from a legitimate enterprise and also legitimate business. So here, for instance, what is the goal of an illegitimate enterprise? The goal of an illegitimate enterprise is essentially to make the scheme seem charitable cause worthy of the payment, obtaining immediate payment before the victim can inspect the value of the product, revising a perception of, or devising a perception of validity. So in other words, making it seem like this is a great product when in reality it may not be a great product. We may also have what's called reloading. And with reloading is where we have fraudulent operations reapproaching those same victims it has already successfully schemed in the past. So in other words, they continue to go back to the same individuals knowing that they may be gullible or knowing that they may be willing to actually be able to invest in those specific opportunities. And then last, we also have the issues associated with geographical location, that it's less likely that tracking will occur if a victim in an illegitimate business or in a separate state or even in a separate country. So many of us actually receive those emails that supposedly are from a prince in Nigeria or from like a princess in South Africa, that they have these millions upon billions of dollars that they have in U.S. Banks, but they can't access them anymore because their countries are going through this turmoil, and they need your social security number and they need your name so that way they can get the money out, and they're going to give you a piece of that pie, when in reality that's not what's happening. They're taking your pie in this particular case. Now, we also see that there are varying telemarketing schemes that go all the way from charity schemes, credit card schemes, lottery schemes, magazine and prize promotions, credit card repair and loan schemes, even investment or business opportunity schemes that they'll show on TV, that they'll say such things as send us $5,000 and we'll have you be a partner in our business. And then you're going to, within the first year, get back $20,000. So this is an investment opportunity for you. And in reality, those generally are frauds in those particular cases. Now, we also see identity theft and identity fraud as being major issues related to the aspects of internet fraud. And one of the reasons that now we categorize identity theft and identity fraud under the categorization of the internet is that a lot of our identity that we actually do see in terms of being fraudulent is actually done through the internet as well. There's a very loose definition associated with what identity theft and identity fraud is, but in reality, the purpose is essentially where a person's information is obtained and used by offenders in the illegal fashion. So in other words, you did not give your consent to give them that information, or even if you did give them your consent to give them the information, such as on an application for a credit card or an application for employment, somebody may potentially take your information and use it for their own personal gain in this particular instance. Some common methods associated with identity theft or identity fraud are essentially what are called the shoulder surfing, where essentially an individual is kind of looking over your shoulder, looking at the information that you're punching in. Let that be, again, your PIN number on your card. Let that be the social security number on an application for yourself. Or even individuals doing what's called dumpster diving, where people are going into dumpsters and getting your credit card information or getting personal information associated with who you are. This is why it's very important that whenever it is that we're going to destroy any type of document that relates to us specifically, you always need to destroy it in any fashion that you can. Let that be through shredding or burning it, or just for safekeeping in a specific location where you know that it's not going to be easily accessible to other individuals. This is why it's also recommended that you do not carry your social security card in your wallet or in your purse, because imagine now losing your wallet or your purse, and you have your social security card, you have your cell phone, and you also have your driver's license and your credit card information on there. Essentially, you've given your life to a person who's found your purse or your wallet in that specific instance. Now, we definitely do have now identity theft laws to deter the aspects of identity theft and identity fraud, so that way it does definitely protect individuals' identity and their against fraud in this particular cases. What are some other types of fraud that we actually see? A healthcare fraud is actually a big one that we actually see. I have some friends who are insurance salesmen and insurance saleswomen also for different insurance companies that are third-party insurance companies around the country. And one of the things that they'll always talk about is that they see healthcare fraud happen all the time, where essentially individuals are in on it with a doctor or with a physician or with a dentist or with whoever it is that that's their primary caregiver for that specific issue, where essentially they'll go in, they'll file a claim for a specific procedure, especially an expensive procedure. They'll doctor documents, all these things, so that way they'll get paid for the services, and then everyone gets their cut. So the patient gets a cut of what that reimbursement would be, and the doctor also gets a cut for that reimbursement. This actually happens a lot with healthcare whenever it is that a person gets treated abroad. Many healthcare insurance companies or even other types of insurance companies allow you to submit a claim if you've been given treatment in a foreign country. The doctor just has to sign off on that, and they have to give you all the documentation associated with it, and then you submit it, and then you can get reimbursed for those specific funds. And that seems to be a way that individuals also submit false claims in those instances. Even payments or receipts of bribes are sometimes seen as forms of fraud in healthcare, getting lower prices in terms of a specific procedure that's going to be taking place, or even giving yourself self-referrals, where essentially you don't allow individuals to have the option of choosing anybody else, but you say, you're going to come to me. I'm referring you to me for this particular instance. There's nobody else that can do this. Now, we also have other issues in terms of this aspect of of internet frauds, where essentially we see individuals who are the offenders and also who are the victims. What are some of the particular victim characteristics? This can really be anyone, especially people who are very careless, who leave information around, are going to be very prone to being victims of identity theft or identity crime or internet crime as a whole. We also see that the elderly are very vulnerable to financial fraud because these are individuals who are already receiving Social Security, they're receiving retirement funds from their employment, whatever the case may be, and in many instances there is no other family member who's taking care of them, and people come in and definitely take advantage of them in their specific situations, especially for charity cases. We also see that for victims of internet fraud, again, these are people who are very careless in disclosing their personal data while online, submitting their social security numbers, their credit card information on many different websites, or their personal information associated with where they live, and their driver's license information when it's for a website that really shouldn't be agreeing to that in any way. Also, agreeing to pay for advances in fees are also going to be ways of committing internet fraud. So in other words, I'm already paying for a service even though I haven't even received the service as of yet. Always making sure that you receive your service prior to paying for it in those particular cases. Again, be very, very cautious in terms of the aspects of your identity online, especially, again, that anybody is really susceptible to the aspects of identity theft and identity fraud, especially online. Or even just schemes that occur online through telemarketers that we just mentioned. So who are the offenders that commit these types of crimes? Generally, they're individuals who are, again, very motivated by money, and these are individuals who are in desperate need or who are trying to find a quick way of earning some money. And one of the things that we do find about offenders is that we actually have low recidivism rates, which mean that they are very less likely to actually commit the same crime and go back to prison for the same crime in the future. Generally, if they've already been caught, they generally tend to deter from committing that same act, but generally, again, that doesn't mean that that always happens. There may be some individuals who definitely do repeat the same criminal act again in the future. Now let's move over to talking a little bit about internet crimes and about some of the issues related to internet crimes. The first one that I'm going to talk about here is the issue of electronically generated child pornography. This is a very big issue that's been kind of brought up to our attention and to our conscious awareness in the last couple of years, that there have been many, many instances of this occurring over and over again, even by people that we look at and we say that those are very trustworthy individuals. And essentially, this aspect of distributing child pornography is essentially where an individual knowingly mails or transports any child pornography and distributes that to other individuals. The Child Pornography Prevention Act of 1996 actually protects individuals from, or not necessarily protects, but it commits individuals to being held accountable for their crimes based on what it is that they've actually done in terms of the distributing of child pornography. So in other words, we're trying to prevent child pornography from actually being distributed to other individuals. So what does computer-generated pornography potentially lead to? Pedophiles may be using images in deviant appetites or in deviant ways, luring children into explicitly sexual activities. Desensitizing viewers into the pathology of sexual abuse or exploitation of children is even another consequence of actually distributing this kind of content. So what do we want to try to do? We definitely want to eliminate this as much as possible, because we definitely do see that this is definitely a wrongful act, especially when you think of a child who is an innocent child who is trustworthy of what other people are saying, and they generally don't know any better in terms of some of the acts that they're committing, and yet people are taking advantage of them. So it's a very saddening consequence of what our current world is going through, especially with the use of the internet, that some of these things may actually be getting distributed. Cyberstalking is another issue associated with internet crimes. And with cyberstalking is essentially where an individual uses the internet to harass a victim. Now we're seeing cyberbullying also being a part of an internet crime aspect, or it's being added to it, because individuals are definitely suffering consequences associated with some of these particular issues. What are the practices associated with cyberstalking? Where essentially individuals search chat rooms for vulnerable individuals. They spy on the person's online activity anonymously, or even are now hacking into a person's computer and using their video equipment to being able to identify things about them, or even look into their homes or into their private lives using cameras associated with their devices in some particular instances. The last things that we're going to talk about for today in terms of our lecture is going to be property crimes. Now, for property crimes, the first one that we're going to discuss here is the issue associated with theft. Whenever it is that we talk about theft, theft can occur in a variety of ways. We can talk about what's called larceny theft and also what's called burglary. Larceny theft is essentially where we have an unlawful taking or carrying, leading, or riding away of a person's property from the possession of another. This generally results in more arrests for females and juveniles, because generally they tend to take things that are not generally under their name, or under their particular possession. So think of it as you borrow your parents' car, but they didn't want you to borrow their car. You take the car, you take it for a joyride with you and your friends. That essentially might be considered larceny theft in that particular instance, because you're taking another person's property away from them in that particular instance. Now that also might be Grand Theft Auto theft, or in those particular instances. Apparently, I'm thinking of the Grand Theft Auto, the game, in this particular instance, but it is definitely auto theft as well in those particular instances. Now, we also talk about what's called burglary. With burglary, we see unlawful entry of a structure to commit a felony or a theft, where an individual is entering another person's premises to be able to steal, having the intention to steal. In your textbook, they made a very interesting note as to how burglary may occur. If a person goes from one part of the room, from one part of the home to another part of the home, and they are not supposed to have access to that other part of the home, that might be considered burglary as well. So it's actually where a person's physical body or their physical tools that they brought with them, anything that is theirs, crosses that boundary between rooms or between property areas, might be considered burglary in those particular instances. Why do people commit larceny or burglary? A lot of it may be related to drug use, or also because of monetary issues related to their funds. So they may be able to acquire some content or possessions of other individuals, sell it, so that way they can now have some money, or potentially use it for drug uses as well. What are the offenders' lifestyles that we see of individuals who generally engage in these aspects of theft? These are individuals who are known to others who engage in the deviance, so they may know what another person owns, so they may go and steal their property. They have exposure to other criminal activities, so in other words, they may be exposed to other types of criminal acts that they may be exposed to on a frequent basis. And also, they tend to have an absence of a capable guardian who teaches them that they're not supposed to be doing those kinds of things, that you're supposed to be respecting other people's property, or helping them along the way financially, or seeking out treatment for drug use in some particular instances, so that way they have no need to commit the theft later on. So whenever it is that we look at the aspects of theft, we definitely do see a very interesting relationship between them. We see that as unemployment increases in the individual, or in a community, or in society, we generally tend to see property crimes also increasing in those particular cases. So there does seem to be that positive correlation between them. So as unemployment goes up, property crimes would also go up in terms of theft. Next, we're going to look at the issue associated with larceny. or with arson, not larcen, sorry. With arson, arson means where we have a willful and malicious burning of property. This does not necessarily have to mean another person's property. It can even mean your own property. Now, whenever it is that we have this aspect of larcen, it doesn't necessarily mean that the entire structure has to be completely destroyed. It can even be scorching of an area, because again, imagine that you set fire to your own home, so that way you can get money from your insurance company claiming that a fire broke out and it burned, one room of your home. So you get the insurance money, but in reality it was you who did that yourself. That's essentially going to be a method of insurance fraud in that particular case. But here you didn't necessarily have to burn down the entire structure to be able to to be able to submit your claim. So again, it could be the burning of property or actual destruction of the target as well. But again, that is not required to actually have destruction as a whole. There has to be a presence of intent that you did it knowingly and willingly, that to your own property or to another person's property. And there also has to be that condition of malice, that there had to be a malicious intent in that particular case, where a person was doing it for some particular gain, either to hurt an individual's property or to receive some type of financial gain in that particular instance. Now, in terms of arson, there's actually different types of arson. We have what are called serial arsonists, where these are individuals who commit 3 or more fire-setting incidents with a cooling off period in between. So in other words, they continue to set more and more fires, but then again, they have that cooling off period where essentially they're already satisfied with what it is that they've done, and then they go back to actually conducting their serial arsonist acts again in the future. These are very unpredictable, and they're the most serious because they can happen at any time, and they again happen in that serial fashion. We also have what are called spree arsonists, where we have 3 or more fires at separate locations with no cooling off period in those particular cases. And last, we also have what are called mass arsonists, where a mass arsonist may have 3 or more fires at the same location within a limited amount of time. Now, one of the issues that always comes up associated with this is, what are the motivations behind an individual creating arson? And to be honest, that's a very good question. John Douglas, who's a researcher associated with the aspects of arson, essentially created 5 different areas or 5 different components as to why the motivations occur for an arsonist. They may do it for vandalism purposes. They may do it for excitement purposes, revenge on another individual based on their property, to conceal a crime that may have been committed at that specific location, or even for their own personal profit. Again, in terms of insurance fraud or other profits that may have actually been generated associated with their criminal act in those particular cases. All right, that wraps up our discussion associated with nonviolent crimes and nonviolent criminals. Please make sure to visit Blackboard this week to look to see what other assignments and other things need to be completed for this week. I do ask you to go and visit that, and make sure you do look at the deadlines, the specific deadlines associated with the completion of your assignments and your quizzes and anything else that are due for this week. If you have any questions, please feel free to call me or email me, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.